You must remember that in the old versions of Corona and V-Ray, we had a lot of trouble with the rendering settings. Now he wanted to set the processing of primary and secondary lights or set the appropriate number for denoise so that we can render the sharpest image. But in the new versions, this case is completely different. And these settings are so optimized and simplified that it is very easy to get the best output with the best settings just by pressing the render key. However, in this tutorial, we will work together on the things that are important in render setup. Hello, welcome to MIMViz. Be sure to hit the subscribe button before starting the video to avoid missing the next tutorial. Well, let's go into 3D Max. In this tutorial, I used the studio lighting scene that we worked with in the previous session. If you haven't seen the training, I suggest you watch it through the link at the top of the page. To access the render setup, just click on this button on the top bar. The shortcut is F10, which opens the render setup window by pressing this button. We start from the top of the render setup window. By pressing this button, we can start rendering. In the renderer section, we can specify what type of rendering engine to use. And in the view to render section, we specify which viewport to use for rendering. Now, it may be the main viewport, which is currently on the top view. We can see that if we go to the perspective view, the name of the view in the viewport changes. And floating viewport, I always use this mode for rendering. We can access it from this part as well. By putting the lock in front of view to render, we can determine that only this view will be rendered. That is, if we click anywhere else in the scene, only this view will be rendered. Let's go to the first tab of settings, which is common. 3 sections of time output, output size, and render output are important in this section. In the time output section, we can specify whether our rendering is for 1 frame or animation with many frames. In the next 2 options, we can use it in animation. In this section, the entire timeline is rendered for us. And in range, we specify from which frame to render for us. That is, if I set this number to 5, every 5 frames from 0 to 100 will be rendered. The file number base is active in these 2 options. The naming of the frame starts with this number. In the frame section, we can specify which frame to render more precisely. Above, we specified from which frame to which frame. But here you can define different intervals for rendering. We can see that the intervals in the list are marked with a space line. The next part is the output size, where we can specify the resolution to be rendered. The default of this section is on HDTV, which are our standard screens. Various numbers are also available in this section. If we need a frame with a different aspect, we should use custom. Many presets are available here and we can choose them. Select Custom, and from this part, you can specify the aspect number. The higher the number, the more horizontal the rendering, and the lower the number, the vertical rendering. In the next part, that is render output, we can specify a path for storing renders. This should be done in animation rendering that has many frames so that the frames are saved automatically. Let's go to the last part, that is assigning render. In this section, the default rendering engine can be defined so that the selected engine is active when opening 3D Max. Well, let's go to the next tab, the Scene tab. This part is the most important part of the render setup, and we will talk about it completely. It includes two sections, General and Scene Environment. We start from the General tab. By clicking Show VFB, the frame buffer window will open. The Start Interactive option starts interactive rendering, which is also available from this section. With Setup Light Mix, instead of adding light select for each light in the elements, do this easily with one click. Different modes can be considered for classification, like instanced lights, grouped lights, and other modes. Let me show you this in another file. First, we create a corona light of the sphere type. We will get a copy of it. We increase its size. And we get a copy of it in instance mode. In the render setup, select the Setup Light Mix option and generate. By taking the rendering, we can see that in the Light Mix tab, two sets of lights have been created for us, one of which is related to the smaller light, and the second two lights which were instances that we can work on its intensity and color in this part. By clicking on Open Material Library, we can use Corona's prepared materials, which are also of good quality. Reset setting resets the render setup settings. Well, I don't reset here because I need my settings. Let's go to limits. In Corona, if we do not define a limit for a rendering, that rendering will continue until we press the stop button. Now that limit can be a certain number of passes from time or noise level. I always use noise level. The best number for most renders is 3. If the rendering needs more processing, the number 2 can be used. We reached the CXR section. The Save CXR option saves our rendering along with all information including light mix and post. and we can later use and change that information in Corona Image Editor. Let me do a quick rendering first. The error is because the common tab is not set to single. Well, 30 seconds passed and the rendering stopped automatically. One very important point is that when we use several limits, the rendering stops when it reaches the first limit. Here, we had the noise limit and the time, which took the time into account. And as you can see, the image noise has not reached 3%. Also, a light mix is applied and all the lights are available in the list. If we hit Save CXR and save the rendering, we can continue the previous rendering at any time by pressing Resume from the file and selecting the desired file. And this feature is great. The next option continues the last rendering of the frame buffer. The next part is render override. Let's start with rendering hidden lights. If we have a light in the scene and hide it. When the rendering starts, we see that the light is not visible in the rendering. But when I check the Render Hidden Lights checkbox, we can see that the light is visible in the rendering. Render only mask. Sometimes we get caught up in rendering and forget to create masks for each object. Masks are used in a single color for easier post-production in Photoshop. And we don't want to re-render. Here, it is enough to activate the Render Only Mask section to render only masks without processing lights and materials. By pressing the render button, we can see that the image is black because I did not add a mask. And of course, no optical processing has been done. And as for material override, which is the most important part of this tab, by activating this part and assigning material to it, we can assign that material to the whole scene. With this, we can have more comfortable lighting. For example, we assign Corona physical material to it and start rendering. We see that the image is rendered with a material. To work on any object, it can be excluded from this section. For example, I exclude this chair. We can have a series of exceptions for this section. It can be defined that displacement or opacity or glass surfaces or other cases do not use this part. You can see that by applying opacity, the leaf part of our plant is cropped and its opacity is fully applied. Or the glass part of the vase. This section is very useful for places that create restrictions for us. The denoising part is also an important part. I always use Corona High Quality. Its default numbers are completely suitable and there's no need to change them, but you can use other options. The only firefly removal option is only used to remove the firefly effect and has a high speed. The NVIDIA option performs one of the fastest denoise, but it does not have a high quality. Intel is a combination of the previous two modes and is slower. In general, Corona High Quality has the best denoise and it is recommended to use this option, but render selected. Sometimes we need only one object to be captured in the rendered scene. If we put the option on the include/exclude list, it will create a list for us to add the required objects to it. I add the chair and you can see that only it is rendered. Other objects can be added. It is also possible to specify that the objects that are in the select scene should be rendered. The last option is to specify the objects for rendering by specifying the object gbuffer ID number. Well, objects have 0 ID by default. If I set the number to 1, we can see that no objects are rendered in the scene. But if I define the chair in the object properties with an ID of 1, only it will be rendered. Let's go to the Scene Environment section. In this section, we can define ambient light. In the first row, it is clear that the light should use the 3D Max setting. You can access it by pressing its shortcut, that is key 8. In single map mode, we can specify that the lighting should be done according to the map we added here. You can define several maps in multiple map and adjust them in a light mix. In the override section, you can assign a separate map for each of the visibility, reflect, and refract sections and exclude the light section from the map. Now he wants to use color or map. And in the last part, we reach the global volume, which is used to define and create fog. Well, let's go to the next sections. The next section, the camera, provides us with all the camera and post settings. These settings include camera parameters, including ISO and f-stop, and other parameters and settings such as bloom and glare, and even DOF and motion blur. But I do not use it, and I set them for each camera separately. The next part is performance, which I usually don't change. At the top of this section, we can specify GI calculation engines. In processing the primary rays, we have the option of path tracing. In the older versions, we had many engines at our disposal, and now the most optimized ones are available to us. If we disable this section, we will only have direct light. But we have more options in the production of secondary rays, and the best option is UHD cache. This engine works great for indoor scenes and highlights. The 4K option has more accurate processing and less noise, but it is currently experimental and may have problems in some scenes. The path tracing option is not recommended, but it can be used for external scenes. In general, the same UHD cache gives a suitable output. In performance setting, we can have more detailed settings, which Corona himself said that the default has the best output. And there's no need to change them unless you have a problem or need to change them. In the displacement tab, by reducing the screen size number, we can increase the accuracy of the displacement in rendering. In the interactive rendering section, if fast preview denoise during render is active, we will have faster denoise in IPR or interactive. If it is off, it will take more time to get the show. But if it is active, we will see the output much faster. But the problem is its watercolor state, and it takes time to get out of that watercolor state. We turn on the caustic solver section when we need the caustic effect. By activating this part, we can determine whether that caustic affects the environment light or not. Here, it is only applied to element caustic, and we no longer have it in the main rendering. And in the exclude-include list, we specify which objects this effect will affect. The DOF highlight. Solver part, added in Corona 10, is experimental. This effect is used to solve the problems of light reflection. The default numbers are suitable, and it is enough to activate it. The last tab is UHD cache, which changes based on the selection of the processing engine. At first, we can specify whether we get single frame rendering or animation. If we have animation, we activate this option. In the Save Load section, we can save a rendering when we get it. We save UHD cache settings by clicking Save to File and specifying a path for storage. That if we want to render that scene again later, we will use the same file and the calculations will not be done again. We can do this by selecting Load from File. Of course, note that no light should have changed in the scene. In the animation, if the light and object are moving, Calculate from Stretch should be used. Otherwise, you can get help from Load the File here. The System tab has no special item. There are a series of general settings if needed. We will mention them during the training. And in the element rendering section, we can add the elements we need. Now it is possible to reflect, refract, or Z depth, or whatever we need. This is from today's training. I hope this tutorial is useful for you. This was the description of the most important settings of the render setup. Thank you very much for being with us. God bless you. Until the next tutorials.